right. Thank you. We'll get started. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Cindy Arnson. I'm the director of the Latin American program here at the Wilson Center. It's a delight to see such a distinguished audience for such a distinguished panel as we have this afternoon. A little over a week ago in Puerto Varas, Chile, Chile took over the rotating presidency of the Pacific Alliance, which is, as we all know, the much acclaimed integration scheme between Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. At a time of economic slowdown in Latin America and the Caribbean overall, and in several countries of the region an outright recession, the countries of the Pacific Alliance have managed to maintain an average annual growth rate of about 2.6% per year since about 2014, which is more than double the regional average. The four Pacific Alliance countries together constitute about 40% of regional GDP, but if you look at their collective exports, they amount to 55% of the region's total. So the handing over of the presidency pro tem of the alliance from Peru to Chile provides a great opportunity to take stock of the Pacific Alliance and what has been accomplished since the framework agreement was signed in 2012. We are delighted to have with us senior representatives of all four Pacific Alliance countries today, starting with Ambassador Juan Gabriel Valdez, Ambassador of Chile to the United States, the Ambassador from Peru, Luis Miguel Castilla, the Ambassador from Colombia, Juan Carlos Pinzon, and Director of the Trade and North American Free Trade Agreement Office at the Embassy of Mexico, Kenneth Smith Ramos. And we are also delighted and privileged to welcome back to the center Tony Esteva de Ordal. You have no idea how long it's taken me to be able to pronounce that last name, who is manager of the integration and trade sector at the Inter-American Development Bank, and I think one of certainly in Washington, but if not in the entire region, one of the foremost experts on issues of trade and integration, as well as Megan Green, until very recently a research assistant with the Latin American program and the principal author of a new Wilson Center study on trade trends within the Pacific Alliance since 2012-2013. And we had a lot of copies of this out outside the auditorium. They seem to have all disappeared, and we will be posting it on our website either later today or tomorrow morning, so that will be available. So we are going to do away with opening presentations and instead have a more conversational format, but in adopting that format, still we'll try to elicit the principal areas of substance and areas of expertise of all four of the embassy representatives as well as our commentators. So I will start with Ambassador Valdez. Chile just hosted the summit in Peru. What do you see as the principal outcomes, the principal advances in the last year or that were made concrete at the summit? And basically, what does Chile aspire to do during its term as president?
Well, first of all, I would like to thank the Wilson Center for organizing this reunion, this meeting. I believe that it is quite right to highlight the meeting of Puerto Varas in Chile, simply because we are living in a world in which trade, open trade, integration are becoming difficult concepts. And at the same time that in Europe one saw the process that led to Brexit, and at the same time that in the election that is taking place in this country, one sees a certain distance with the idea of free trade for Latin American countries, and a series of observers, very valuable and important observers, are promoting integration and free trade, has an enormous symbolic value. The Pacific Alliance has only 5 years of age, And in 5 years, I have to say, it has attracted an enormous amount of attention precisely, I believe, because of that. It is curious, I was reading this morning Larry Summers in the Financial Times saying, populist opposition to international integration is on the rise in much of continental Europe and has always been the norm in Latin America. I'm sorry, but I disagree. 20 years ago, Mexico established with the United States the first big step in terms of opening the markets of Latin American countries to free trade. And after that came Chile, and then Peru, and then Colombia, and then the Central American countries. I would say that, contrary to what Larry Summers says, in fact, Latin America is becoming the place where apparently trust in open markets is clearly more predominant, apart from the Asian countries, of course, and this has a lot to do with the Asia-Pacific nations and the relationship between the Pacific Alliance and these countries. This is my first comment. The second comment is that, as a former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Peru said recently, Minister Garcia Belaunde, one of the most important elements in the integration of these countries is that we want to integrate policies. We want to integrate the way in which we do things. We want to associate ourselves in not only among us, but opening our economies to the rest of the world. And this, I think, was the spirit of Puerto Varas and the meeting which we had last week. I would like Cynthia to briefly mention what are the topics and the priorities we would like to give to the Pacific Alliance as the pro tempore presidency. The first one is education and science, technology and innovation. We believe that the importance and of the strengthening and development of technical education in our countries is absolutely essential to acquire both the productivity and the competitiveness and the human development of our citizens. Therefore, we want to work together to recognize our higher education degrees and diplomas, to strengthen our technical vocational education, and to promote the mobility of students, professors, scientists in our countries, between our countries, because this, of course, will give us a more important capacity to compete in the world economy. Innovation is also a very important element in what we discussed in Puerto Varas. The role that investment in young people's education has in meeting this challenge is extraordinarily important. And I have to stress the idea of the development of policies to achieve a productive transformation. This is one of the, and has been one of the problems, most essential problems of our economies. To promote this productive transformation is indeed a priority for us. And therefore, we want to implement public-private agendas. We would like to work together with our private sector in order to accelerate the possibility of business in our, among our countries and between our countries and other countries in the world. A third factor was that was discussed was the progress towards the internationalization of small and medium enterprises, which is a very essential part of our economies and has enormous difficulties to internationalize. Therefore, the promotion of small and medium enterprises and the association of small and medium enterprises among our countries is critical. We would like to create an entrepreneurial capital fund. We would like to amplify the support and the network of supports to these enterprises. We have, Chile, for instance, has an agreement with the United States to promote medium-sized and small-sized enterprises, which has been extraordinarily useful to us. I think we have, all of us have important lessons and important experiences to share among us in this area. Of course, we want to, and this is the fourth point, to facilitate trade and customs operations. This is very important. We want to incorporate technology into the transactions for international, intra-regional trade. Let me say that there are two, and with this I finish, there are two elements we would like to stress, and we stressed during the meeting in Puerto Varas. The first one is the importance of fortifying the relation and cooperation with observer states and trade blocs, such as ASEAN, Mercosur, and APEC. And therefore, we want to implement a new framework of cooperation with observer states aimed at presentation of projects with regards to education, science, technology, and innovation. We have discussed an agreement with New Zealand, who has proposed negotiating an FTA with us, or has even proposed to become an active member of the trading bloc. And also we have established a strategic alliance with Canada among our observers. At the same time, we have underlined that this is a regional project. And therefore, the main challenge we face is to make intra-regional trade grow, since our trade among us is still quite small. And in the effort to make this trade among us grow, we need to incorporate, as I said before, the small and medium enterprises. Before finishing, I want to say that we are extremely enthusiastic with this process. The fact that we had during this meeting the presence of President Macri from Argentina gave us not only the hope that we will be able to increase our relationship, the relationship that unites us in the Pacific Alliance, but that we are making a way to relate ourselves with Argentina and with Brazil, with Paraguay and Uruguay, economies that are extremely important to us and have been historically associated to us. Therefore, this meeting was a very successful one, and in the middle, as I said at the beginning, of this difficult news around the world on trade and progress in terms of integration, it is a clear fact that this meeting in Chile was a step forward. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Ambassador Valdez. Ambassador Castilla, Peru just left the presidency. Looking backward over the last year, what do you think were the principal accomplishments? And let me accompany that with perhaps a devil's advocate kind of question, that oftentimes the Pacific Alliance is celebrated because of what it represents, because these are countries that are committed to liberal, open trading order towards deeper integration. But as Ambassador Valdez was saying, there is very little intra-regional trade, and so the question is, you know, where does the rubber meet the road? Has the Pacific Alliance been able to accomplish certain things that give it real traction as a bloc, and how do you see Peru's presidency as having advanced that purpose?
Well, thank you, Cindy, and thank you for the invitation to the Wilson Center. My greetings to my colleagues. I think Ambassador Valdez has made a great summary of the issues, and I think there wouldn't be too much of a difference between what I said during Peruvian's pro tempore presidency, because there's a continuity in policies. But I remember about in the winter of last year, we were hosted, well, before Peru took over the baton from the Mexicans in the lovely cultural center you have in 16th Street, and the foreign affairs ministers of the four countries. I think the Chilean Minister Munoz was missing, but we had all four high-level representatives. And there was a brainstorm, and we were part of that discussion to see what were the issues that the Peruvian presidency had to push. And I think there's three areas. One was to design a way so that we could better relate with the observer countries. You know, the list grew from 42 to 49 countries as far away as Ukraine and Argentina joined during our presidency. And it's precisely on those 4 areas that Ambassador Valdez has mentioned that the cooperation has been, is going to be organized. He mentioned science, technology, and innovation as one area, SMEs as another area, education, and trade facilitation. Those are 4 areas that will organize the engagement between the Pacific Alliance and the other observer countries. So that was one thing that was discussed, how to organize this and to avoid this dispersion, of a lot of people being interested, a lot of countries being interested, but having some structure to that interest. The second was to consolidate previous mandates we see in the previous summits. So the most important thing I would say during the Peruvian pro tempore presidency was the 2 key building blocks of the alliance came into effect, which was the framework agreement and the additional protocol, which is the free trade area among the 4 countries, came into effect during our presidency. Both at the beginning, the framework agreement, and just in past May, the free trade agreement. And then the third area was what's next, because you can do so much in trade, and trade provides a lot of potential. And I'll go to your question, Cindy, in a little while. But how to avoid dispersion of topics, because you can get very excited and you can go and do a lot of things, but the risk is that you end up doing not much. And so how to avoid this dispersion and the topics the new topics that were coming. And I think there's been a clear role given to new actors, which are the finance ministries in the 4 countries. So it's not only trade facilitation, it's not only the single windows that the IDB has helped all 4 countries, education, human capital, mobility of people, but also giving a role to actors that have, I think, very, very important say in policies in the countries. And so informally, finance ministers have been meeting, but I think there was a clear mandate in Paracas, and there's an annex even in the Punta Varas or Puerto Varas summit, in which we have 4 areas of work, and that has been part of this work, ongoing work during the Peruvian pro tempore presidency. One issue I'd like to add is that we had 2 Peruvian presidents attend the Puerto Varas is right? Puerto Varas, the outgoing Peruvian president and the incoming Peruvian president. So, and actually to add to this policy continuity, the Pacific Alliance idea was launched the very last couple weeks of President Garcia's government. So now it's 3 Peruvian governments in a row that are really betting towards open policies, towards integrating among ourselves with the rest of the world, sound macroeconomic fundamentals, rule of law, private investment-driven economies. And in the case of Peru, having policy continuity, I think it's something, quite telling, and of the four countries. But it was quite, outstanding to find presidents with different backgrounds, but with a common objective that through trade, investment, integration, deeper integration, we can go, we can achieve, benefits for the population. And President Kuczynski, President-elect Kuczynski participated in the issue. So now you mentioned, Cindy, about how to make the trade, really, how to create value chains and how to be able to mobilize more intra-regional trade, which is quite low. But it's precisely the progress in trade facilitation is a progress in harmonizing all the regulations, is a progress eventually in terms of integrating our capital markets, financial integration, it's when these are all instruments to be able to achieve, more trade among ourselves. If you look at Mercosur, strong links between Argentina and Brazil for obvious reasons. You look at the Andean community, used to be at least Colombia and Venezuela in the past, but we don't have that. We don't have that high trade among ourselves. But I think we're creating the framework to do so by making progress in very micro issues, such as improving, the security procedures in our customs, exchanging information among our officials, and very micro type interventions, policy interventions, to be able to actually create the right environment for the private sector to participate. And last thought is that the private sector participates quite actively in the Pacific Alliance. And I think they're one of the engines, really. Governments respond and create the enabling environment for the private sector and entrepreneurs to do their thing. So I think those are, adding to not to be repetitive, to the things that Ambassador Valdez have said, because there's continuity in the agenda. There are new challenges, I think, more in the financial area. Energy is a new area. I think that there's a lot of potential as well, and how to pool our resources together to attract investment in these trying times. I think that's another key message, that our region is open for business, is serious about high standards, and I think that this is an ongoing work to consolidate what we've achieved so far.
Thank you. Turning now to Ambassador Pinzon. Several people, actually the two previous speakers, have mentioned the presence of President Macri from Argentina at this summit, together with Luis Guillermo Solís of Costa Rica. There are now 49 observer countries. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on what the role of the observer countries is, and also what is the process by which additional countries could actually become members of the alliance?
Well, Cindy, first of all, thank you. Thank you for doing this meeting. I find it as a very useful one. Only thing thank you for doing those kind of questions. So I can try to innovate a little bit in my answer, but speaking after the wisdom of Ambassador Valdez and Ambassador Castilla is kind of hard, you see. Real experts and people that has really been working in depth onto this. I think we're going to miss Ambassador Castilla just by, telling that, Ambassador Castilla is leaving soon Washington, and I think your ideas here were always very welcome. So I guess we will now invite you as an advisor to everything, if not to tell, for better positions, hopefully you're going to get it in the years to come. Well, before answering a little bit of your question, I think there's some things that are valuable just to remind our audience today. And there are some things that are already happening as part of the Pacific Alliance. At the beginning, let's face it, we start to find some criticism because there was the idea that was not specific progress or concrete issues related to the alliance. It was a lot of coherence of discussion. And believe me, that was the first and very most important thing. Pacific Alliance is about a common set of ideas: democracy, freedom of speech, trade, and being next to the Pacific. And those four things create a very strong elements of commonality that, as Ambassador Castilla expressed, led us to harmonize on different issues and different agendas. And I'm saying this because it's important to understand that Pacific Alliance is not a trade agreement. A trade agreement is just one of the steps and elements of this very important effort. And actually, I will underline that as a key element of the recent advances. Starting May the 1st, we have in place and acting the protocol of trade. So we have I understand something like 92% of the tariffs basically in a set of an agreement between the four of our nations. When Ambassador Valdez mentioned the importance of increasing intra-trade, now I think we have the tools, having this protocol. So by having this trade protocol, we might expect in the next set of years to really measure what are the consequences of this intra-trade opportunity. That will be the first thing. Second, as we said, the opportunity of talking on many more issues than trade has allowed very specific and concrete results on issues like a joint promotion, exports and investment in certain countries. So we have, an effort in Morocco or an effort in Turkey happening. The four of us already in place. Not to forget the idea of joint promotion of tourism, and of course the ideas of trade facilitation and harmonization specifically on the financial markets, capital markets at the same time. So I insist is very well beyond the outreach of a trade agreement. It allows us to do several other things. Not to forget specific issues on movement of people. So we have been able to suppress some of the visas and to create some facilitation for those who want to come inside the alliance to do different investment or different kind of labor activities. I think that's very important. In addition to that, education. The alliance already is facilitating and providing certain sets of scholarships. I understand something like 1,200 were provided that allow already students inside the alliance to move to different countries of our alliance and profit and benefit from educational opportunities. I think those are elements that give a lot of strength and a lot of depth. On the financial integration, has been one of the examples that I value the most. One of the features of the alliance is that we have decided, as countries, not to have yet a bureaucratic organization. It is more designed in a process in which the current authorities decide to meet and agree what to do next. The best example, with, I believe, strong results as of today, is the meetings of ministers of finance. They get together and they talk, of course, on taxes, tax codes, and in addition to that, they engage on issues like the capital markets, the integration of our capital markets and stock markets, and in a way, moving our economies to just look as a single one economy. And that's where I see some of the power to the future and probably connecting these to the observers and to the future members. I think that what is interesting about the Pacific Alliance is if we can see it in the years to come as a block of integration, but an integration of wills rather than just a fact of agreements, but as an issue of convenience. I don't want to get in depth about Brexit too soon, and I guess the real experts on the field will talk about it, and we'll look on features on what are the pros, what are the cons, maybe what are all the cons, what resulted about it, right? But I think that here in the Pacific Alliance, we might have an opportunity to learn the lesson and somehow find out how to keep the level of integration on a perspective of benefits of different activities rather than just seeing ourselves as obliged members of a certain kind of structure. I think it's a different approach with similar intentions, but more flexible. It's a little bit of what I'm trying to tell. Time will tell, and we will not know until we keep developing these efforts. And as the presidency of Chile right now led us through the different agreements that our presidents made. But with that, I think that makes the alliance more attractive to new members. And we are seeing this. Ambassador Valdez explained the case of New Zealand, which all of us are kind of interested about seeing New Zealand coming. Others are speaking about Australia as well as an opportunity in the years to come. But looking now to our part of the world, having President Macri and having President of Costa Rica there became a very interesting signal that countries like those can start already to harmonize with the four countries without necessarily being already obliged to nothing in particular, but just, adding and harmonizing policies and opportunities. And actually in the meeting, there was the idea that some other set of countries were accepted as observers. I don't have the list, or I did have the list here, but I cannot find it, I have to confess. But there's a set of countries that was allowed to be part as observers. I think these countries are all coming with a lot of interest, of course, with some expectations of concrete progress, and we will need to keep delivering onto that, but at the same time with the idea that here you have a flexible partnership in which you come by will, but at the same time you come because you have similar features, and you're allowed to try to, connect on the levels of ideas that I described. That's what I have for now, but I think I'm not trying to overstate or oversell the idea of the Pacific Alliance, but I'm trying to tell it's a flexible, interesting opportunity, and as Ambassador Valdez said, in an era in which apparently, the kind of connections and bridges that were happening are not as stable as they used to, here's appearing a new way of doing, the same idea about doing more Legos than, let's say, concrete infrastructure, to put it in a perspective, in a way that can be, connected in a more stable, long-term way. That's a little bit what I see.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador Pinzon. Ken Smith Ramos, Mexico, together with the United States and Canada, just held the North American Leadership Summit, the meeting of the Tres Amigos. Given Mexico's deep integration with North America, how interesting really is the rest of the Pacific Alliance to Mexico?
Thank you very much, Cynthia. Thank you, Megan, for the invitation. It's a real honor to share this panel with Ambassadors Castilla, Valdez, Pinzon, and with my good friend Antoni Esteva-Verdal. Ambassador Carlos Sada sends his regards and his regrets for not being able to be with you this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Going straight to your question, yes, the Pacific Alliance matters to Mexico a lot. It is very important to Mexico, and let me tell you why. As you rightly mentioned, the economies of the US, Canada, and Mexico have achieved a high level of economic and trade integration, powered mainly by the North American Free Trade Agreement. So in terms of our trade relationship in North America, we created trade in the order of over $1 trillion. The idea is to strengthen this both through mechanisms of cooperation within North America that were strengthened in the process that just took place in Ottawa, where the North American leaders met at the end of last month, and that we hope to strengthen it further once we have the Trans-Pacific Partnership into place. Nevertheless, when you look at Mexico's trade policy and its engagement with other regions in the world, the Pacific Alliance is very important because this is the first time where Mexico has been able to engage in such a deep fashion with countries in South America in its history. It is the first time that we're able to put together, in addition to the different elements of cooperation that have been mentioned already, a trade agreement of this magnitude that eliminates 92% of trade and of trade barriers, and the next to be open by the year 2030. And in addition, let's look at some of the numbers to see the real magnitude of the Pacific Alliance. Put together, it is the world's 8th largest economy. When you look at the issue of inter-regional trade, yes, we start from a lower base of what we have in North America because of the sheer size of the economies with whom we trade in North America. Yet, intra-regional trade in the Pacific Alliance has increased 39% over the last 10 years. That's a jump from 12 billion to 17 billion. So you're already seeing that we're doing the right things in the Pacific Alliance. And with the mechanisms and the tools that we're creating within the mechanism of cooperation, we will have further trade, and we will be able to increase that dramatically. Most importantly, the importance here for us, and I'm sure for our partners in the Pacific Alliance, is that we are joining forces with countries that see economic integration and trade liberalization as a pathway to growth and prosperity. And I think that's one of the key elements that we can take away from the efforts that we're launching and that we're implementing in the Pacific Alliance. And it's interesting that there are strong parallels and convergent objectives into what we're establishing as the key directives in the North American Leaders Summit and in the Pacific Alliance. Taking some examples of the key priorities in both are the issues that some of the ambassadors mentioned in terms of trade facilitation, the emphasis of education, which is our investment in the future, both economically and socially for our societies, the issue of innovation. And the issue, which is very important, and we're seeing it as a trend worldwide, we see it in TPP as well, but very strongly so in the Pacific Alliance, which is the effort to internationalize SMEs, to provide mechanisms to guarantee that they can be incorporated into the benefits of globalization. In other words, mechanisms such as the Entrepreneur Capital Fund that will be created, the SME observatories, the exchanges between entrepreneurs that can travel because of the mobility of people between members of the Pacific Alliance brings great assets and allows us to learn from best practices within this construct. So we're seeing a lot of areas where we have convergence of objectives with what is being promoted in North America and what is happening in the Pacific Alliance. And we believe it's very important in the current world trade environment to see that in reality, when critics turn against free trade, against economic integration as the culprit of economic uncertainty, we must turn that argument around. And as we're doing in the Pacific Alliance, we must send the signal that trade liberalization, regional and economic cooperation and integration is actually part of the solution to allow countries and societies to deal with the challenges posed by globalization. So what we're doing here, we believe, is part of the answer, part of the solution. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much. Before turning to Tony and Meg's comments, I'd like to thank a number of people in the Latin American program who have been really critical to putting this event together. Karina Peña, who's here, also a number of interns, including Sofia Oliveras from Colombia, who's helping out, as well as the staffs of the 4 embassies who are here. You know who you are. You obviously know how difficult it is to coordinate the schedules of this number of high-level representatives, and I thank you for your collaboration in this effort. Tony, the IDB is in certain ways the official secretariat, if you will, of the Pacific Alliance, in that it is tasked with providing all kinds of technical support and advice for these various processes of integration. How do you see the process to date, if you could give us a certain element of stock taking?
Thank you very much, Cynthia, for the invitation and to participate here with the ambassadors. First, let me just say that yes, the IDB has been supporting the Pacific Alliance from its very beginnings. We are not the official secretariat.
Of course,
actually,
the
Pacific Alliance does not have a very institutional structure, but we are very happy that we have been able to support in many different aspects the work of the four countries. I think the 4 ambassadors did a great job in terms of outlining what the alliance has been achieving in the last 5 years, and in particular in the last year, and what are the kind of objectives that is planning to achieve in the next year under the Chilean chairmanship. But what I would like to do, maybe to complement the ambassador's remarks, is just to put a little bit in context what is this initiative in what's happening around the world. And I think one way to describe the Pacific Alliance is that, and I think it has been said, this is an initiative of its time. It's really an initiative that has been able to design itself or adjust itself at the type of changes that the global environment is facing. And I'll put 3 examples of that and how the Pacific Alliance is actually doing this job. First, the Pacific Alliance, I think, is adapting to what has been major structural changes in the global trade that we have seen in the last 15, 20 years, and I'll say why is that. The Pacific Alliance, I think, is doing a great job in adjusting and designing itself as an initiative to the changes that we're seeing in the way that we produce things, what is called the fragmented production networks that we are seeing around the world, and the Pacific Alliance, I think, is responding very well to that challenge. And the last one is the way the Pacific Alliance is responding to another structural change that we have seen in the last 15, 20 years, that is the way that we regulate trade, the way that we negotiate trade rules around the world. From a multilateral way of doing things, the multilateral system, until the mid-90s, to a more regional bilateral basis. I'll just put some examples on each of these three things. In terms of the trade, if you look at the last 15, 20 years, the major structural changes that we have observed is this emergence of participation of emerging and developing countries in trade. They represented around 20% in the mid-90s. Today is 40%. 40% of global trade involves an emerging and developing economy today. And out of this 40%, half of it, 20% of global trade, is South-South trade. This is trade that is happening between Southern. This is a major structural changes that we haven't seen this for many years. And the big player here in these changes is China, or Asia at large. And the Pacific Alliance has designed itself as an initiative that is precisely to try to connect to these new markets, not only to that the Pacific markets, Asia, China, but also to act, and this is, I think it has been already said, act as a center of gravity of what's happening in the region vis-a-vis Asia and vis-a-vis other partners. These are countries in the Pacific Alliance, and it has been noted, that traditionally have been really the ones who have linked up with the major trading partners around the world. Those are the Mexicans, the Chileans, the Colombians, the Peruvians, are the ones who really have been connecting the region to the rest of the world through the FTAs, through US, through Europe, and through Asia. So it's really becoming a potential center of gravity for connecting this type of regions. So it's really this attention to these new markets for the regions, which is Asia and China in particular, one of the elements that characterize the Pacific Alliance. Second, in terms of how it's adjusting to a regime in which the production is more and more fragmented around the world. This is what we call, the wall of global value change or the regional value change. Latin America, we know it's a region that is not yet part of these production networks in general, not only the Pacific Alliance, but in general, it's a region that has not yet been connected to this, what we call global value change. A couple of numbers that make this very, very clear. If you look at the percentage of exports from Latin America to the rest of the world as a percentage of total exports on intermediate goods, what we call parts and components, things that will be part of a final good, this number has not changed for the last 15, 20 years. It's around 15%. We are very, very Mexico is a little bit a different case, but in general, this is a number that has not changed. In Asia, this number has jumped from 25, 30% in the mid-90s to 40 to 50% today. It's a completely different type of structure of trade. If you look at more sophisticated numbers, which is, if you look at what we call economists, the value added of trade, so how much of what we export is things that we have imported, so how much we use our imports to actually create final goods to exports, these numbers are very low for Latin America. This is around 15%, 20% compared to 45% in Asia. And the Pacific Alliance, the type of things that it has done so far, and I think it has not been mentioned, I want to mention this in very, very specific terms. What we read in the press is about the trade agreement is the amount of liberalization that has been achieved. We have now 92% or 95% of the goods will be tariff-free. This is probably not the most important news of the free trade agreement. The most important news of the free trade agreement, to me, is the harmonization of the rule of origin or the accumulation of the rule of origin. It's a very technical concept, but it's something that means that a Chilean that wanted to export something to Mexico and was importing something from Colombia or from Peru, maybe couldn't do that before because of the rule of origin. This is now is possible. You have an entrepreneur in Chile can buy any input from any other country, from Colombia, from Peru, and Mexico, and can access the preferential market in a free way, something that couldn't do before. This is the type of rules that you need to create this type of production networks that today exist in the world. So this is a major achievement. This is something that very few groups of integration have done around the world. So it's actually really a pilot, an example of the type of things that we need to do in this type of initiatives. And the last concept that I want to talk about is how the Pacific Alliance is also contributing to what we have this, what we call the spaghetti wolf of FTAs. We had been creating rules for the last 15 years on a regional basis, on a bilateral basis. As you know, there has not been multilateral agreements in place since 1995, except the Trade Facilitation Agreement. So what do you need to do in a world in which you have such a number of FTAs in place, that we have more than 300, almost 400, is to try to have a process of convergence. Countries have to start linking up their own trade agreements. And this is what the Pacific Alliance has already done. Mm-hmm. These were 4 countries that have very good FTAs among themselves bilaterally, 4 by 4. And the first exercise that they did was this exercise in convergence. They say, they get together and let's create one unique agreement among ourselves. This is the type of things that will need to happen around the globe much more often. This is this type of process of convergence that we need. So on this, and I finish with this, and this I think is one of the key innovations of the Pacific Alliance. This is an initiative of its time because it's adjusting to the type of challenges that we are facing globally. And I think this gives a lot of examples, a lot of ideas for other initiatives to follow.
Great. Tony, thanks. Meg, you've done some work on the issues of intra-alliance trade. I was wondering if you could enlighten us.
Well, I'd like to thank Dr. Arnson as well as the Latin American program for putting together this event and allowing me to participate. So this presentation is largely built upon the publication that was available outside. And I think it fits well into this conversation as it provides a little bit of data to, I think, many of the key points that have been made. And if I had to kind of distill the main point of this paper into a couple ideas, they would be that trade within the Pacific Alliance overall has really decreased since 2013. However, there is some indication that in other areas trade is expanding and that other goals of the alliance are perhaps being met. And I'm going to further expand upon these in 3 main ways. First, I'm going to look at trade with outside alliance major trading partners. Then I will look at trade within the alliance itself, and then finally focus on trade with some key Asian economies. So to begin with, this graph here illustrates the Pacific Alliance trade with many of the large major trading partners, such as the United States, which can be seen in blue, the European Union in red, China in green, and the Pacific Alliance, for comparison purposes, is in purple. The graph on the left illustrates the percentage of total exports going to these various economies, and on the right, it's the percentage of total imports. And you can kind of see, and this point has been made, that pretty much across the board, for the majority of the Pacific Alliance countries, trade within the Pacific Alliance constitutes a smaller proportion of their total trade as compared to these large trading markets. And furthermore, data that is available in the publication also suggests that these numbers have actually decreased since 2013. So it further exacerbates this discrepancy that can be seen. And this graph here kind of builds upon that and illustrates this more concretely. So the graph on the left is the percentage of exports among the Pacific Alliance countries, and on the right it's the percentage of imports among the Pacific Alliance countries, where the x-axis denotes the exporting country and the colored components of the bar graphs denote either the export destination or the import origin. And you can see that pretty much across the board again, trade within the Pacific Alliance has largely decreased since 2013. The large exception here is Peru, and I want to focus a bit on Peru as across a couple of measures, it actually stands as a bit of an exception to a lot of these trends that are observed in the data. Not only has Peru managed to increase its overall share of exports to the Pacific Alliance, it also has managed to deepen its trade ties with the Pacific Alliance via intra-industry trade, which has been attributed or associated with the creation of value chain linkages, which has been mentioned from various of the panelists. And this could be important, as it has been mentioned, for the Pacific Alliance countries. And specifically, Peru has managed to outperform the other Pacific Alliance countries in 2 out of the 3 key sectors that are studied in terms of its level of intra-industry trade. And these two sectors are manufacturing and agriculture, where since the official signing of the agreement in 2012, Peru has managed to surpass the other Pacific Alliance countries in terms of its level of intra-industry trade integration in the agricultural sector, which is kind of interesting and maybe something to watch in the future. And then lastly, I wanted to comment on the trade shares between the Pacific Alliance and these large Asian markets that is one of the key components of this alliance. This graph here illustrates the bilateral exports of the total exports to key Asian markets for the Pacific Alliance, as well as Argentina and Brazil. The key markets that I've included here are China in blue, Japan in red, and Korea in green. And Argentina and Brazil are really presented here for comparison purposes in order to present kind of a juxtaposition of to the performance of the Pacific Alliance relative to other large Latin American economies. And you can see that between 2013 and 2014, both Argentina and Brazil have really decreased their share of total exports going to all three of these key Asian markets, whereas the Pacific Alliance has performed comparatively well. Specifically, 3 out of the 4 Pacific Alliance countries have managed to increase trade with both Japan and Korea, and 2 out of the 4, Colombia and Peru, Colombia pretty substantially, has increased its percentage of total exports to China. Not only are these numbers in themselves impressive, but also in light of the slowdown of the Chinese economy and the ability of these Pacific Alliance countries to nevertheless expand their share of exports to the Chinese economy as well as to these other Asian markets. So overall, much of these findings kind of just mimic what has been previously said, that a general look at the data would suggest that trade between the Pacific Alliance is rather low. However, looking at other measures indicates that for some countries, specifically Peru, in other areas, they're excelling, and specifically with the goal of reaching and further integrating with some of these key Asian markets, that is an area that is shown a significant amount of improvement in the recent years.
Thank you. Okay. I'd like to have a second round of questions before opening it up to the audience. I'm going to start now in reverse order and go first to Ken Smith Ramos and talk about these production and other forms of manufacture or other forms of creation of value chains in different sectors. Mexico has extensive experience with creating these value chains with the United States and with Canada within North America. In particular, you can look at the automobile industry as a case par excellence of these kinds of things. To what extent can Mexico's experience in creating these kinds of value chains be of benefit to the other Pacific Alliance countries? And are there specific steps that are being taken to build that and make Mexico's success more available to the other South American economies?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I'll just touch upon very briefly what has happened in North America in terms of the one of the key impacts of the NAFTA has been not only increasing the amount of trade between the three countries and investment in the region, but also the strengthening of supply chains, the ability to create industrial clusters that are linked with one another across different sectors, taking advantage of competitive and comparative advantages on both sides of the border, in the case specifically speaking of the U.S. and Mexico, and increasing the value, the joint value of the exports that North America sends to the rest of the world. In the sense of, for example, 40% of what Mexico exports to the world is U.S. value. And that shows you that many products in the automobile sector that you mentioned, the automotive sector, both in final automobiles and parts and components, parts go up to 8 times across the border before they're incorporated into a final vehicle that is then consumed, either used and sold in the North American market or to other markets throughout the world. So one of the key elements here is that, taking a page out of what Anthony mentioned, one of the big advantages that you have in this construct that we're building with the Pacific Alliance is this ability to begin accumulating origin. In terms of the rules of origin harmonization, and this is one key element that we should look at in the future as a key stepping stone to taking advantage of strengthening supply chains between the members of the Pacific Alliance, is how we can now incorporate value from all 4 members of the Pacific Alliance into final products, which in any one of our countries can take advantage then of a network of 59 countries that with which these 4 countries have free trade agreements. Of course, the question is, as you mentioned, the spaghetti bowl. Within ourselves, within the Pacific Alliance, you are able to fully implement this rules of origin harmonization and this integration. So I think the first step is to look specifically at an analysis of the demand within our countries, where it is that we are sourcing from other regions in the world, but that now the advantages that the Pacific Alliance is bringing, that we can reduce cost and be more competitive if we develop joint production mechanisms between the 4 members of the Pacific Alliance. Some areas where Mexico is already exporting quite a bit in terms of percentage-wise to the Pacific Alliance countries. You have some of the key sectors where we're strong in: televisions, steel products, some pharmaceuticals, electrical and household appliances, and obviously automobile. There's no reason why we shouldn't be able to do an analysis of the overall products that the 4 Pacific Alliance countries are requiring, are demanding, and producing in order to further strengthen the specific supply chains across all of these sectors. The other part of the puzzle is in terms of how do we engage with other regions, and that allows us to strengthen supply chains. And I think here we can look at some of the key trade agreements that have been negotiated or are being negotiated in other regions of the world that are important. Trans-Pacific Partnership is key. 3 out of the 4 members of the Pacific Alliance are part of the TPP. We'll see if in the future Colombia can join there as well. And that's it is a game changer in terms of the opportunity that generates. Because in that case, you're able to, as if all the members of the Pacific Alliance also have access to the Asia-Pacific market, which, by the way, is the region in the world that's going to grow the most over the next 25 years, adding 1 billion consumers, middle-class consumers, into their societies. You know, you want to be at the front line of that growth. If we're able to link the Pacific Alliance with North America in terms of this rules of origin harmonization, and in turn with the TPP, then you're really connecting the dots and getting rid of the proverbial problem of the spaghetti bowl and the disconnect between different regions in the world. So to make a long story short, looking at an analysis of the demand in our countries, specifically in the Pacific Alliance countries, working further in issues that are key, not just in terms of tariffs, but the trade facilitation elements. These ideas that the ambassadors had mentioned in terms of strengthening customs procedures, harmonizing the verification requirements, the single window in customs that we're working towards. All those are key steps in order to facilitate trade. The way we see it when we talk about facilitating trade between Mexico and the US, by strengthening and streamlining our border, we're trying to make it as easy to ship a product from Querétaro to Chicago as it is to do it from New York to LA. There's no reason why we shouldn't be able to do the same thing from Santiago to Mexico City to Tokyo. And that should be the overall objective in strengthening supply chains.
Great, thanks. You mentioned TPP, Ambassador Pinzon. How does Colombia's, don't want to say exclusion, but the fact that Colombia is not a member of the TPP, how does it affect its view of the PA, of Pacific Alliance specifically, and does it, in certain ways, even if it eventually is able to join the TPP, and even if the U.S. Congress actually approves the TPP, big questions, is the Pacific Alliance in some ways a buffer or an insurance policy, given the fact that the other 3 members are part of this agreement and Colombia is not?
Well, first of all, I think we have to be very thankful to our partners of Pacific Alliance. They have been supporting Colombia and promoting the idea of Colombia being a member, a part, both of APEC and of the TPP agreement. And it proves, from Colombia's standpoint of view, the value and the usefulness of the Pacific Alliance as it is. Because it's not just Colombia going alone to ask an issue that is important for us, but is, immediately getting the support of the other 3 members as a proof of a block, to put it in perspective. So suddenly, because of this, we're getting some kind of put in a way, at least a power to have the discussion. That's point 1. Point 2, I think we were supposed to be members from the beginning. For whatever the reason, didn't happen. There are many ideas around why it didn't happen. Apparently, we were supposed to do something a little bit more. probably we were expecting, some idea of allowing us to engage easier. For whatever the reason, we are not in, and that's not important anymore. Now the question is how important is for Colombia to be part of. And I think President Santos, during his visit here last February, stated very clear, Colombia wants to be part of TPP. As simple as that. And he didn't made a major statement on the idea, but just put it as clear as it is. From a competitiveness perspective, the discussion among the experts from Colombia's side has been that not being part might not necessarily imply a high cost or a high benefit, let's put it that way, but has a consequence of just others being part of something that is happening and us not being part of it. So probably correcting a little bit my phrases, they don't see any practical benefit immediately, but they see a high cost of not to be part of. So it makes Colombia, to be considering this. Now, by saying all this and knowing all the tensions that I see even in this city, not to say in other parts of the world about the TPP, I think we have to be prudent. We better wait, for those who are already on to really make it happen. But yes, I think we should be, in the number one spot in the line to try to get in when everything happens.
Ambassador Castillo, you're previously the Minister of Economy and Finance of Peru before becoming ambassador here. A number of people have mentioned the question of financial integration as one of the next areas where the Pacific Alliance will be making headway. Could you describe a little bit, both in public policy terms and also in terms of the dynamic in the private sector, what is going on in financial integration among the Pacific Alliance countries? And Tony and Meg, please feel free to jump into this conversation if you'd like.
Yep. Thank you, Cindy. Yes, this actually this work of financial integration, I think had its peak when Mexico was able to join the MILA, the integrated Latin America. All four stock markets working together, and there's been progress, but still the potential is there to be grabbed. If you add together, mathematically, the four capital markets, it will be the largest one, or very close to Bovespa size. But adding doesn't mean integrating. And there are a lot of harmonization of the tax codes needs to take place, ensuring, lowering transaction costs to have more SMEs participate, and harmonizing regulations is a big issue. But let me also, beyond, the usual financial integration, capital market, there is, I think, 4 areas that are part of the agenda, which are quite, I think, important. One, and it's part of the agreement of Puerto Varas. One is talking about financial inclusion, because a lot of this actually comes from the G20 discussions that involve the finance ministers. I remember the Mexicans, when they hosted the G20 meeting, the financial inclusion and using, mobile phones and the way to expanding access to financial services is a key area, and the U.S. has been quite supportive, as a matter of fact, for this effort. The second area is working towards addressing some of the gaps that we have in our infrastructure. Now, you talk about the potential of interregional trade, but still very costly. Our logistics and infrastructure is more costly to export, to perhaps to Mexico than it is to export to some European country. And working towards financing infrastructure, it is an important thing. This also involves harmonizing policies towards having more or less, similar frameworks to have public-private partnerships in infrastructure. A third area is that the 4 countries, we're very prone and very vulnerable to natural disasters. So a way to pool our risks and to perhaps issue some sort of catastrophic bond among the four countries is a way in which we can actually pool our own, similarities and differences. And in pooling risks, we can be able to manage these risks, this risk more appropriately. And the last area, and not least important, is in this age in which transparency is of utmost importance to fight money laundering, fiscal transparency, abiding by highest standards in terms of sharing information. This has been an important part of our conversation with Panama, for instance, in terms of having real-time access to tax information, and this I think is an area of future work. So all of these are areas, again, that are part of the agenda of finance ministers in the Pacific Alliance. But they're in tune as well with other initiatives. SDGs need financing, and this entails mobilizing domestic savings. So therefore, there is a link to other, more broader agenda. The same with financial inclusion. The same with being less, more resilient to disasters from climate change, etc. So I think these are areas that, in a way, will make the agenda of the Pacific Alliance richer in time and will involve more agents. But again, this is a promise. This is a potential. We need to be sure that we mention this, not to oversell, the concept, but to be quite clear that this is work in progress. Law has been achieved in 5 years, more than when we compare to the other integration mechanisms in the region.
Great, thank you. And then finally for Ambassador Valdez, when Foreign Minister Heraldo Munoz was with us maybe about 18 months ago, maybe even 2 years, he talked about the fact that Chile had more open trade with a country such as Brazil than it did with the other members of the Pacific Alliance. So drawing on that observation, I was wondering if you could comment on how Chile has attempted to position itself as a kind of bridge between the Pacific Alliance and Mercosur, and what does that mean really in terms of the future, given, for example, the interest of President Macri in potentially joining the Pacific Alliance. If you could address how Chile views its role not just as a Pacific country, but as one that has deep and very important economic relationships with the countries of the Atlantic coast.
I think that we have more trade with Brazil than with some of the countries but not more open trade. We have trade agreements signed with Peru, with Colombia, and of course with Mexico. We have even signed 2 trade agreements with Mexico since the 90s. Therefore, we have all the conditions. On the contrary, I have to say, with some of our other neighbors in the region, we have much more difficulties in terms of the stability of our trade. Mercosur has differences with the Alliance of the Pacific, differences in tariff structures, differences in regulatory environment. We have seen our own development and international insertion in different ways since the 90s. But that doesn't mean that we have not integrated. And I think there is an interesting reflection to make on the role of governments and of the private sector in these processes. Because if you look at Chile and Argentina, we are countries that have integrated enormously during the last 20 years. The level of integration in the regions, among the regions that are border in the Cordillera de los Andes, in the south of Chile, in the north of Chile, and the north of Argentina. This integration is remarkable, but it has had much more to do with vicinity and with the activities of the private sector than with actual designs. On the contrary, one of the things we need to do with Mercosur today is to try to make progress in areas like accumulation of origin, single window, trade facilitation, customs cooperation, and also in the infrastructure area, which is extraordinarily important for Brazil and for Argentina to get to the Pacific. Therefore, we need to, it's not an easy process. What we understand in Chile is that given the fact that we have seen in the present Argentinian government and also in the present Brazilian government, Minister José Serra, during the day of the same day that he took control of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, indicated the interest of Brazil in the Pacific Alliance. He was very explicit on that. Therefore, we have an opportunity to initiate a dialogue which could lead us to different sorts of associations, but particularly more than that, to efforts to do things together in certain areas. The Pacific Alliance will have no Brussels. And this is important because we believe that this way of looking at things and looking at integration allows others to participate in the way they want, and therefore to be free to decide the way in which they want to associate. In that sense, I believe that all the members of the Pacific Alliance have no orthodoxy to respect in terms of the way in which we will treat others. Of course, we have, the ambassador of Colombia has expressed it in a very clear way, certain commitments to principles in terms of democracy, freedom of expression, of course, but also to certain ways of looking at the economy, the role of the private sector, and the way in which we see the way in which we should integrate into the world economy. And these are things that give us the basis to develop our own integration within the Alliance of the Pacific. But this doesn't mean that we are not going to associate ourselves with countries that feel differently in certain areas. Now, let me say one thing. When we negotiated trade agreements with Mexico or with the United States or with Canada 20 years ago or 15 years ago, I have to say that some of these agreements were informed, and not only informed, but pushed by the private sector. The role of the business sector in promoting these agreements and this association is absolutely critical. And I believe that if the private sector is not interested, simply not interested, this will not happen. Now, when one turns to the TPP, for instance, I was listening to Juan Carlos, and I was thinking that what he was saying about Colombia was exactly what I could say about Chile. In fact, we are not sure of the immediate advantages we will get from the TPP. We have trade agreements with all of the members of the TPP already. Therefore, it could even become a risk to us to be part of the TPP. But at the same time, we are very clear that given the sort of orientation we have given to our economy and to the way in which we have integrated into the world, we cannot afford to be out of the TPP. That's clear. This is why we want the TPP. Now, we observe that the TPP has many dimensions, and it has not passed at our side the fact that now the geopolitical elements are being included increasingly in the discourse, which is something that also is important to us given the sort of relationship we have with the Asian countries and with China. Therefore, this is a process in the making. This is a process in which we will observe different aspects of it in the next years. But I believe that the Pacific Alliance constitutes an excellent observatory of what is going to happen, both inside the region and in the way in which Brazil and Argentina are going to evolve towards a more open framework of their own economies, and also towards the way in which the hemisphere is going to deal with the Asian countries and with China in particular.
Thanks. Tony, any additional?
Maybe just very briefly, and not to take much time from the audience, but maybe just a quick reflection on what hearing the ambassadors. One thing that is very clear, I think, and I like to emphasize that, is that the Pacific Alliance, it's really a different type of initiative of what we have seen in the past in this region, and and even globally. And I just have 3 examples of that, and I think we have to keep this in mind. It's very, very different. It's a big departure of what the region has done in terms of regional integration. First one is an obvious one, which was mentioned by the Mexican representative here. This is not a customs union. Most of the traditional blocs in our region have been customs unions. Mexico and Chile have Chile associated member to Mercosur, but those are 2 countries that have never been engaged in this traditional way of doing integration in our region, being part of these blocs that we had for 20, 30, even 40 years. And this is a very important departure of the way that the region has done this type of projects. This is not a customs unions, this is just a very FTA plus something else. And I think for the good reasons. So customs unions is an extremely difficult thing to do, and we have seen the results in this region. That's why there are so few customs unions around the world. Second thing, and this has already been said, and I want to emphasize this is a very pragmatic, very flexible scheme. And the way you see that is that even though it has a strategic vision of the long term of what they want to achieve, really what they are trying to do is year-by-year results. That's why the Secretary Pro Tempore has this important, is in charge of delivering specific results year by year. This is actually something that we have not seen also in other types of schemes. It's very flexible in the sense that incorporates elements of trade, elements of education, elements of innovation in a very kind of pragmatic way, depending on what is really feasible to do it under the conditions that these countries operate. And the last concept, and this is, I think, I don't want to stretch too much the argument here, what happened in Europe in the Brexit, and I think it's a lesson for this initiative, this way of connecting, doing things that connect with the civil society, with the citizen, these micro policies. In a way, this is what has happened. The European Union had the part, the European Union was a project that was very connected to very specific things, the students, the civil society issues, the SMEs. Now it's really a macro project, we're talking about the euro, we're talking about just the fiscal issues because of the reasons, the structural reasons that these economies face. But it has departed a little bit of this connection of the integration initiative to what it really means for the entrepreneur, what it means for the student, what it means for the ordinary citizen. And I think what the part of the success, and I think the sustainability of the Pacific Alliance in the future will have to be to keep connecting with this type of projects to the regular, the regular population.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. We do have some time for questions. Please wait for the microphone and identify yourself by name and by institution, if you would. Let's start with this gentleman here.
Hi, Rafael Bernal with the Hill newspaper. More on the political side and a bit to what you were just talking about. How much did the Pacific Alliance help to counter the wave of populism that swept Latin America a few years back? And sort of on the same train of thought, how could it help to counter a potential wave of isolationism coming from the developed world?
Okay, let's take another one. This gentleman here, a couple rows back.
Thank you. Alejandro Gamboa with Crumpton Group. I think President Mauricio Macri's recent comments regarding the Pacific Alliance have garnered a lot of media attention, and I think there's a lot of interest in whether or not that might mean greater proximity between the Pacific Alliance and Mercosur countries. And in terms of increasing integration between those 2 blocs, what are some of the potential challenges in that regard? What are some of the potential stumbling blocks? Thank you.
Okay, and we'll take a third one in this round, right here.
Hello, Lawrence LaMonica with Sol Capital Management. Just following up on a comment made Ambassador Valdez. I would like to know regarding private sector participation, what is the scope and the role of the private sector in the coordination that is taking place today among governments? For example, how involved are the SMEs today. We know that in the case of existing trade agreements, multinationals had a lot of pressure, significant influence in the past. But if today the focus is on SMEs, how are they contributing to the Pacific Alliance conversations?
Okay, I'd like to take, even though we're almost out of time, I'd like to take a second round of questions. So perhaps if people could be very disciplined, we're not going to have time for every single person to answer every single question. So who would like to take the first question about the rise of populism? And
I'll make a small comment.
Sure.
And is that on certain issues, Ambassador Castilla, who's the former president pro tempore, representative, can do it. But for the others, we have a president pro tempore right now. So Ambassador Valdez can do it, That's a good thing of
So the
working
two of you
in
are
a
in the
very
hot seat.
flexible way,
Okay, all right. Well, I do welcome anyone who wants to
the
jump in.
The former ambassador in a couple of days, but that's okay. No. Actually, the free trade agreement was a major tool to avoid populism. And I can tell you, it was our constitution on the one side and our free trade agreement with the U.S. In societies that were used to a lot of rent-seeking, capture, benefits, tax breaks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And once we had the free trade agreements in place and our constitution, there was nothing to do but just to follow course. President, Ambassador.
Sí, en Chile el populismo no se da. We have had, well, I have to say that your question is well oriented in terms that it is clear that the Alliance for the Pacific is clearly a rejection of protectionism. It is clearly a rejection of protectionism, and in that sense, it reflects the conviction and the will of governments that, given the size of their markets and given their own experience, have concluded that their integration into the world economy demands openness, participation of the private sector, and their own integration. And we have seen a lot of efforts in our 200-year history to integrate Latin America. And we have seen a lot of failures too. We are not resigning to the purpose of integration, but we believe, and we have chosen this path because we believe it's the best one.
Other questions that were asked? People want to?
Yes, maybe the question about the
Private sector.
See the private sector. Let me say that since the beginning, and of course I would very much like to hear my colleagues on this, but I think we will agree that since the beginning there was an important interest from our private sectors in the process of the Alliance of the Pacific. I have to say that in our case, given that for a certain time the Alliance of the Pacific fell in a moment in which we were into an electoral process, there was a discussion on the Alliance of the Pacific which tended to be somewhat ideological. Yet, after the election of President Bachelet, the participation of Chile was assured. And in that sense, the private sector had a lot to do with the process of conviction that this was part of the same road that the country had followed during the previous years of our transition to democracy since the beginning. Now, what we have lacked, I believe, is a way in which we have to, or we can incorporate the medium and small size enterprises into this process. And this is why I was saying that since the Peruvian presidency, but particularly since the last meeting, the commitment to find ways to incorporate and to internationalize the small and medium-sized enterprises has become a very essential part of our integration. In fact, just to finish, I don't imagine a process of increase in our internal trade without the participation of the medium-sized enterprises and the small-sized enterprises. Therefore, this is a sort of exercise we need to do.
Can I add something? Because
Sure.
the SME issue is a big issue, not only for Pacific Alliance, but for APEC, that is being discussed right now, and for TPP. There's a chapter on SMEs in TPP. And rules of origin, accumulation of rules of origin is perhaps the best way to be able to have, these value chains develop, incorporating SMEs. So I think they're at the heart of these, wave of integration that we're seeing.
There was a question on President Finance, President Macri.
Yes, if you could repeat the question?
Yeah, basically, I think there's been a lot of interest recently in terms of potential Thank you. I think there's been a lot of interest in the media regarding possible greater proximity between Mercosur and the Pacific Alliance based on what President Macri said recently, and I wanted to know what might that look like, and also what are the challenges facing greater integration between those two blocs?
Some of that, I think, has been addressed,
Yeah.
but if there are others who want to add anything in particular?
If I might say one thing,
Sure.
there is an action plan which was produced by the Alliance of the Pacific. It was a document proposed by the Alliance of the Pacific to the Mercosur countries. Mercosur has responded with another document. This shows, first of all, that there is a very concrete interest to make progress. This action plan is a very precise, pragmatic document. It has no discourses about principles, and what it tries is to basically generate the conditions to increase our trade.
Okay, let's take a second round, and with this, we will conclude. My gosh, there's a lot of hands. I'm going to take first this this woman here, then a couple rows in front, this gentleman, and we'll end it there.
Thank you. Julia Herman, Johns Hopkins SAIS. I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on MILA and any potential barriers to expansion, for example, liquidity.
Okay, we'll go there, and then a few rows down. Right over here, Sophia.
Hi, thank you. Leah Lucas, Wallace Carver Fellow with the Economic Research Services of the USDA. I had a question about the role of energy. I heard mentioned very briefly. I was hoping you could perhaps expand on what has been done to date in the energy field with this alliance, and in the future, perhaps some projections based on, differing oil prices or other energy initiatives that are in the forecast.
Sure. Renewables. Sir.
Felix Rosanzi from Argentina. My question is, what are the next steps or the first steps regarding innovation? You have explained something about education. Valdez has told us about what are the plans in education, but I have not listened to any idea on innovation, which is a priority according to what it has been decided last week or last month in Chile. Thank you.
Okay, why don't we ask Ken to address the MILA or Ambassador Castilla, whichever.
Well, I think with MILA, the issue is that still, we don't have enough liquidity, enough issuers, enough instruments, and this entails actually a lot of harmonization in the policies. The potential, I think, lies in terms of pooling our institutional savings, and among them, our pension funds are the ones that are the key, actors. But now there's discussions in many countries in reforming their pension systems. In my own country, for instance, to improve coverage, there's going to be perhaps a major reform going on. So it's very difficult, to tell you the truth, to be able to harmonize a moving target, because we are actually doing reforms. So when we change our tax code and we reduce taxes to harmonize with some of our neighbors in the Pacific Alliance, they also have tax reforms that went in different directions. So harmonizing, it is, I think, one of the most important issues. And it's not really, in terms of the tax, it's not really how much you get out of paying taxes, but for investors and participants in the capital market, is the transaction costs of having to pay the tax, not really the actual payment in itself. But I think if we can get national treatment, for instance, if our pension funds, if a Peruvian pension fund can invest in Mexico, in Chile, or in Colombia, and give national treatment to such investments, we do a major push in liquidity and a major boost in terms of deepening our capital market. That's regarding MILA. And very quickly, perhaps regarding energy, I think there is the intent of the Peruvian government, and I think it's going to be perhaps pursued by the following government in terms of starting to sell electricity to our friends in Chile. And that's going to, again, boost integration in this area where there is complementarities that are quite obvious.
Gas.
Yes.
Let me mention something
Sure.
very quickly.
Please.
Just very quickly on the issue on innovation, there's a strong impetus, as was mentioned by all the ambassadors today, on really advancing on the issue, on the one hand, of internationalizing SMEs and furthering within the structure of the Pacific Alliance the concept of furthering innovation. And this involves specific programs that are being launched in terms of allowing, along with the measures that are being taken, allowing mobility of professionals and entrepreneurs to do exchanges between the countries of entrepreneurs that can travel to different countries, travel to innovation centers, R&D centers, learn from best practices, and try to incorporate that into their activities in their own countries. And in addition, when you talk about a fund to capitalize SMEs, a lot of it is not just money that will help them launch businesses, but actually providing the capacity building that involves, in many instances, how do you enter into new sectors in IT and other sort of the so-called 21st century economy activities. So there are definitely strong plans along those lines.
¿Alguien más on these questions? Tony, innovation? Meg?
Innovation.
Great. There was also the question. There was the question about Argentina. Well, some people have. Well, that's been addressed. If anyone else wants to jump in, por favor.
I think the question is enormously important because, in fact, the discussions have insisted and have highlighted enormously the idea of innovation. Now, according to the meeting of Puerto Varas, the governments agreed to implement a private-public agenda of 2 years on this issue of innovation. They want to push for the functioning of the Pacific Alliance Business Accelerator, and angel investors in the area of ventures and enterprises with a technological base. I don't think I can be much more precise than that, but I have to stress the fact that in all the discussions, recent discussions of all the working groups, this issue of innovation has had or has always been a very important, or considered a very important one.
Just to underline and probably not saying much that what Ambassador Valdez said, I think it's a big leap what happened on that front in Puerto Varas. This is a global discussion these days, but there are not many integration agendas that include the idea of having a specific fund for those purposes. So I think it's actually an innovative idea for innovation, if I can put it in a way. We'll see how it works.
Great. We're out of time. I don't want to abuse your ability to get home at the end of a long day. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panel members and commentators. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Muy bien. No, yo creo que fue excelente.
Presidente.
Muy bien.